And a very warm welcome. Tonight at Hyde Park, we will be talking about the global south, the power rivalries that we talk today, and the implications on South Asia and the Indian Ocean region as a whole. I've invited to our studios the Curie Research Fellow of the International Centre for Policing and Security, University of South Wales, Anant Mishra. A very warm welcome to you. Ayubowan to Sri Lanka. And I think your specialty is Pakistan, Afghanistan and Iran. Let's start off about the region, what's happening. We've seen a lot of developments in the recent times, of course, on the news, and you write a lot. Your research focus is also this. Let's leave out everything else in the global south, but the Middle East. Where do we begin here?
It's a very interesting context of when you say where do we begin in the Middle East, because we've begun in the Middle East quite, I would say, decades ago. Middle East has become a turning point with regional powers, strategic interests coming in the Middle East, particularly with respect to the Saudis, the Qataris, the American dimension, and the voices that have recently come up in the rise of what many academicians have considered this as a rise of Palestine. So with Australia and with Britain, as in recent, has come up in the solidarity of Palestine. Those are the kinds of voices that have come up, which has never been seen before, with countries opening up to a pro-Palestinian approach, if I may put it very, very academically and very, very kindly. The whole gambit of a military operation that was conducted, which the Israelis have termed it as in the interest of securing their borders, in the interest of what essentially happened after October 7th, a massacre. We see American intervention, the Washington coming up, and at a very unique point of time where the academics divide the whole issue of the Palestine and Israel, largely because of what the UK decision was in the 1948 and the 1947. So it's a time where global powers and strategic regional powers are coming together to essentially understand the idea of, if I may put it very plainly, what to do with Palestine. Mm-hmm. So this is an issue.
What do you understand, especially as we move forward, when we say recognition of Palestine by some major powers and others, as you said, pro-Palestinian policy, or at least approach, as you mentioned, and we're talking about the Middle East from crisis, chaos, to some sort of a balanced approach or recognition as these other countries say. So where are we going from here? How will this shape the Middle East, the power dynamics, the war, and of course intervention of the US?
Well, many academics have termed this as the rise of a second edition of Abraham Accords. And whether it is a rise of Abraham Accords or if it is a new accord that is going to come up, totally depends upon how individual nations and interests perceive the issue of Palestine. There are members, let's say for example Argentina, which is pro-Israel, but we have also the UK openly coming up in support of Palestine. So the idea is, with global powers, essentially I see a division between those who are voicing for Israel and those who are essentially voicing for Palestine. It's a quagmire essentially, because the talks if you look at the case of the hostages, they've not still been released in full. And the idea of the wind that essentially flows is, in the eyes of the academia or the academic world, is some sort of annexation or accession of the remaining parts of what was the Gaza. If we put it in very plainly. Mm-hmm. But there is more with Hamas which as experts say have gone, but the ideology and the idea of Hamas is not dead, which has emanated from the idea of many countries and many leaders voicing very openly in the context of supporting their intent to Palestine. So the idea of killing the Hamas is eventually what the Israelis have earlier perceived as Hamas is dead, is of the contrary. The idea is, I would say, resonated to those who are potentially not pro-Hamas, and there is a trend of young kids to elder generation coming up in support of reflecting their ideology, not essentially Hamas, but in the idea, in the I would say in solidarity with Palestine. So the cause of Palestine has become more stronger than it was quite a few years ago.
Interesting. So when you say, although Hamas could have been eliminated or they're no more, the ideology has grown stronger. What does this mean from a geopolitical sense also, and the alliances that were struck? Yes, you see more and more aligning with this cause. And at the same time, what does this mean to a region like South Asia, where we're talking about the Middle East also playing a major role, but essentially these major superpowers who are aligning with one country and the other?
So the idea of Hamas in the academic world is normally understood with the killing of Yahya Sinwar. So many academics believe that the killing of Yahya Sinwar would eventually capitulate Hamas, but it did. In principle, the architecture is gone, the organizational development of the structure is gone, but with the killing of Yahya Sinwar has also at some point of time made him a martyr in the eyes of those who were following, particularly in Lebanon. So the assassination and the killing of Yahya Sinwar was on the contrary, turned out to be more as a recruitment propaganda with there are large signs of recruitments, sympathizers who may have not liked what the Hamas did or had a very different opinion, but with the extent of damages in terms of the humanitarian crisis that have been created, particularly in Gaza, is a symbolic representation of what many people, many residents who have lost their family members perceived what Hamas was fighting for. So what essentially turned as a massacre on October 7th has given the opportunity for Hamas and for those like-minded individuals with the extent of trauma being created and the loss of life being endured in Gaza as a symbolic reflection of what Hamas did in terms of the fight, the right for Hamas to fight against Israel was right. So the justification of existence of Hamas has even, I would say, is trying to win up in the argument of ideological references, where we have young children, we have young, as old as 10-year-olds coming up to talk about why they have intentions to join a militant group to fight against their adversary, the Israel. So this unification in a larger population will eventually create a whole dimension of new front in terms of recruiting of fighters who will potentially, as low in the age of 10-year-olds to as high as 40-year-olds, do have the potential to fight in a larger battle when push does comes to shove.
But that would be yet another dangerous situation, risking even children joining or taking up arms. Before we go to South Asia, I'd like to go back to Israel here. You mentioned about the delicate situation here. So what does this mean for Israel, Israel's Western allies and their influence in the region?
Israeli ideology, I would say the idea of Israel to conduct an exhaustive operation was to essentially eliminate Hamas in the beginning. But what we see, the whole, and I would say in the academic world, they're perceiving this as annexation of Gaza. The idea of annexation was never in the cards the operation only landed when Hamas was finished. And it did eventually when the entire organization capitulated. So with Hamas gone, with Hezbollah losing half of its leadership in American and Israeli drone strikes, and the recent strikes in Qatar, it reflects that the war eventually for the Israelis hasn't ended. So the question is, when will the war end? When will the strike against the Hamas and Hezbollah? The idea behind Hamas and Hezbollah was to eliminate them, but they have been eliminated. The leaders have essentially gone. Hamas is nowhere to be found. But killing individuals and killing an idea are two different things. So with this aggressive maneuver that, in my humble opinion, Israelis have conducted in terms of a warfare, is eventually being counterproductive, because the loss of human life is resulting in many common civilians that has nothing to do with Hamas ideology, has deemed it necessary for them to take revenge and fight and join, which means more recruitment, more foreign fighters, more fighters with vengeance, and as young as 10-year-olds with the will and the sheer intent to take up arms and join any militant organization, whether it is Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, whether it is even the AQAP, Al-Qaeda in Asia Pacific, to Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, in the Middle East, till any organization that had limited to expanded operation capabilities, that recruitment opportunities are open for them.
So the wave of radicalization, extremism, what's the threat here for the rest of the world?
Well, you have a 10-year-old willing to fight, and in 10 years he's going to be a 20-year-old with a 10 years of fighting combat experience. So if you look on a tactical composition, he would take the most battle-trained soldier on the field. And I'm not talking about one, I'm talking about essentially those whose future is potentially ruined, who have been forced to live in humanitarian camps. And those are motivated individuals, motivated in a way that they have an objective, they have a mission, and these kind of ideologies are never, can't be killed, because these individuals become martyrs, which eventually open the doors for 10 more, 20 more, and 100 more if the war doesn't stop.
So are your academics worried that this will move further beyond the region, or at least where the war is concentrated?
If these individuals potentially have an open opportunity, let's say the Houthis, to bring such element of foreign fighters, or let's say another version of Hamas comes up, and the Israeli government again decides to go on an offensive, so there is a whole cyclical operation that essentially moves, which means that this cycle of vengeance will never end. And that also means there are going to be new opportunities for Al-Qaeda to potentially come up. And I'm just talking about from the top of my head. These are institutions, these are terror organizations that are not dead, but they are, I would say, disorganized, with large recruitment possible in the near realms. The recruitment would bring them an opportunity to bridge together. So what happened in 2014 in Mosul, or Daesh coming up in good numbers, then the similar is something that we could see in years to come.
While you highlighted risk of growing extremism or children taking up arms and extremist groups regrouping, Israel can say that they're trying to eliminate all this from happening. And that's why the war has not ended, to not just eliminate these physical groups' presence, but the ideologies itself, so that the world does not face terrorism. So how do you really bring academic knowledge into this?
In terms of military operation versus ideology, ideologue is essentially something that can't be killed. Excessive military operations will more harness that ideology in a way that has never been seen in that aspect. Now, everyone thought that, let's talk about Sri Lanka as we are here. Everyone was of the opinion that after the alarm, there's going to be peace, prosperity. But then 2019 brings up again bad and sad memories of how terrorism does not essentially flow within a territorial boundaries of one particular country or one particular entity. So it's not what is affecting in the Middle East that is going to be precise in terms of Middle East. It is important for Israelis to also evaluate, and I'm sure they have evaluated the extent of military operations that they've done as a responsible military. It's the duty of professional military organizations to evaluate what is eventually going to come. But it is also important to understand that any implications in terms of Middle East will not remain in the Middle East, because you have the Taliban government in Afghanistan. We have we still have the Al-Shabaab operating in Somalia. We have Boko Haram still active in parts of African countries. And then we have Abu Sayyaf group still operating in Southeast Asia in our own backyard. So they are potential, and this is just the names that I can tell you on the back of my head. So there are many more organizations that are waiting for such individuals, vulnerable individuals that are seeking vengeance.
What will the role of the United States be here? We've seen the United States, let's say, being involved in a lot of wars in the name of, again, eliminating terrorism. This happened to many Middle East countries as well. So how is this really going to shape the outlook for the world? The US, a major power, Israel's alliance, and we see now with the trade war, Trump tariffs, there's a lot more leverage that all of our countries should have in order to be a part of this.
I think Donald Trump is I'm hoping that he does what he does best when any president comes up in the interest of the nation. But it's a bit it's a bit of a dilemma, because it's difficult to anticipate his movements, and there are opinions, and if you read what is happening in the media, he's not essentially known to do what he promises. In words of some of the experts. So it's a very tricky situation of how Washington is going to take an action in terms of terrorism. But the good note is that Washington is very keen on taking narcos, the narco traffickers, up in South America, and they are doing counter-narcotics operations in Mexico. So I can always, as an academic, put up the side of a good, I would say, a positive note of how President Trump and his administration is going to take care, or is going to tackle the element of counterterrorism. But we also need to understand that Israel and US has a very long-standing history, and it's not going to fade away just because of a much major complex scenarios come up. And the US did eventually had conversations with the Qataris, and the Saudis were involved in a lot of negotiations as well. So I'm sure a positive negotiations will come out of the way. And there is no other solution, if you ask me, in terms of a positive negotiation, or even a negotiation. That is the only way to solve as major crisis as this one.
Just to deviate from the topic, to go into warfare, we've been talking about modern warfare, entirely different from what we've seen traditionally. So what's the role of, let's say, artificial intelligence, cyber warfare as we move forward? The world saw more wars than it had in the last few years maybe. But we're going into an era where artificial intelligence will play a major role, will really take on much of a role in how things are managed. So what is its role here, and how complex will it be?
I think artificial intelligence is going to change the way how we perceive as war. And when it comes to perception, artificial intelligence would involve more about a mix of kinetic action and indirect kinetic action, and in terms of perceiving how nations view it, and how does one perceive it as. So justification of war is also something that AI can do, making the warfare much more exhaustive in terms of casualty and collateral is also what the AI is capable of. So there are no winners in the war with the AI, but definitely AI has revolutionized how war is being perceived, with morphed images coming up on and influence operations, misinformation campaigns being conducted. There's a plethora of examples coming in, whether you talk about the Israel-Hamas war or the Russia-Ukraine war. There is no shortage of examples coming in with misinformation in terms of warfare. I would say giving false information to even in the academic, forget about the academic, even in terms of military commanders who are unable to, who face a huge amount of challenge dealing with it. So yes, AI has revolutionized already, and we have yet to see how far it will go.
What about Pakistan here? We saw escalation between India and Pakistan, Operation Sindoor, and we saw a quick de-escalation of tensions. But South Asia here, we are standing in a very fragile geographical location also, with the power dynamics playing a major role in small states like Sri Lanka, and we see a threat of transnational terrorist groups, and academics as yourself warn of a resurgence of extremist ideologies which can regroup. So how vulnerable will Pakistan be here?
I was wondering when will you ask me this question. Operation Sindoor was a necessity, and the massacre at Pahalgam, where the identities of individuals were picked up on the basis of religious preferences, and the brutality of how it happened by the state-sponsored terrorists. It was coming, if I may say so. It was bound to happen, because these were, if you look at from the story till Pahalgam, you have Pathankot, you have Uri, and then there comes in the Balakot strikes as well. So it was estimated to have escalated in this way by academics such as myself. It was a necessity in terms of when we see from the perspective of terrorism, because as I can put up into you that Pakistan is a state sponsor of terrorism, and New Delhi has put this out, whether it is at the UNHRC or whether it global platforms. So it was inevitable, and Pakistan has no shortage of terror networks, and they are still active. If you look at the open source images recently, the damages done during Operation Sindoor, the whole area has been rebuilt, and there are at the open source, if you look, there are terrorist groups again building up, reconstructing their terror camps. So this cycle of promoting terrorism is something that Pakistan has been doing it for quite some time, and this makes it a powder keg with terror factions on the borders, terror factions that are affiliated to the Pakistani military coming up and taking and infiltrating India's borders. Their loyalty essentially lies till the time they are willing to do what they've been asked. But there is no difference in a good terrorist or a bad terrorist. There is no good terrorist or a bad terrorist, and I will say it as many times as I can, because what we see in the context of Pakistani establishment promoting those terrorists, there will be a point of time, and as according to the experts, it's going to come very soon, that Pakistan will have to face those terrorists themselves.
And I think it's time we take a short break here at Hyde Park. We are in conversation with Anant Mishra of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. We'll be right back after this short break. To stay with us. Welcome back. You're joining us at Hyde Park, and we're in conversation with Anant Mishra, Marie Curie Research Fellow of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. We were talking about the region from Afghanistan to Pakistan and now South Asia. It's very important that the security situation in South Asia is stable for our countries to grow the least integrated region from the rest of the world, but yet we see so much of influence, whether it's extremist ideologies or whether it's geopolitical struggle, everything happens in this concentrated land. So let's talk about Sri Lanka here a little. We've seen India, Pakistan and China, the power dynamics. What does this mean for us as we move forward when we see India, a big powerhouse here in our region, and we see US? We saw tensions rise because of these trade pacts and tariffs. At the same time, China is the reason for a lot of uneasiness of India, the United States. So how will Sri Lanka balance these, in your opinion?
I think Sri Lanka is in a very unique position to balance, because if you look at the geopolitical position, the geographical position where Sri Lanka is, for Colombo, it's not just about, and I say it on many forums, it's not about global competition, it's about global cooperation. So the idea is to open the door and bring stability, not from the perspective of how Europe or how US perceives it as, but as well India's security partner in the Indian Ocean region. And if you look at 90% of the trade that essentially happens at sea, and 40% of the Europe trade on the external element crosses the Indian Ocean region. Now, if you look at the transposition of how the Colombo port is, 70% of the goods that come here are not domestic. Yeah. So if you look at the position where Colombo is, essentially it's a very unique position to bridge the gap between diplomacy, strategic partnership, and I would say in terms of infrastructure development, which is phenomenal. By the way I see it here in Colombo, and that is where the three lines come together, and Colombo becomes the doorway to a global South cooperation element, with anchored in New Delhi, supported, reinforced through Colombo.
But it's the global South also that suffers because of these power rivalries, as India, China, the United States seeking more and more influence in the region, and more countries, smaller states, depending on these major powers. There is a need to, of course, strike a balance. But for Sri Lanka, the risk, sitting in a geopolitically important location, also with all major shipping routes running right through our location, our geopolitical location, strategically speaking, how important is it for Sri Lanka to really keep this kind of power rivalry away from the country? And how has there been any country that has been successful in managing them so that Sri Lanka can learn from?
I think on the contrary, Sri Lanka is the example littoral states need to learn in the context of managing them. Because when you look at the art of depth diplomacy, as the word that has been coined for a very long time, Sri Lanka is a perfect example to do it in a way where the great powers does converge, and the conversion of those great powers gives an opportunity to Sri Lanka to understand and play in the perspective of in the larger, broader interest. So when Sri Lanka, I would say, performs in a way that sends a message that when there's a great competition, doesn't mean that it's competition, but it's cooperation per se, and takes the symbol of cooperation up to Europe, Brussels sees Sri Lanka as a strategic logistical hub, which is to its advantage. And then small littoral states, like as regional littoral states such as Maldives and other regional states who are watching Colombo's closeness not only with New Delhi, but also the partnership that it had and it has with China, and the logistical supply chain that it has across the Europe. There is no better way than to say it with Colombo doing it all.
But there are a lot of concerns about India's or China's Belt and Road Initiative, or maybe within the country sometimes whether Sri Lanka is leaning more towards India or India has more influence in Sri Lanka because of the close linkages. Of course, traditionally India and Sri Lanka has more linkages, but we're talking about the digital space, data theft to infringement to security, sovereignty. So with all this, are you still saying Sri Lanka is safe?
Sri Lanka is safe relatively when Sri Lanka strengthens its domestic security perspectives in the context of, let's say, the new anti-terrorism bill coming up, or let's say a data protection bill that exists as a legislation, and which also means its territorial integrity not to be compromised by any regional power, even if it means it's a great power. So the moral responsibility lies on the Sri Lanka itself, which to my understanding has the knack, means, mechanisms and the resources in terms of the political will to potentially do it. So the idea is it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it will eventually happen when the domestic security element is strengthened in a way when territorial integrity or attempts to violate a sovereign nation's territorial integrity is dealt appropriately.
Is there a potential for a cooperative security architecture in the Indian Ocean region? And how can, once again, Pakistan be brought into this layout?
Now, if you talk about security cooperation, I think I just attended the Goal Dialogue, and there is no other platform better hosted by Colombo itself than the Goal Dialogue, and the Chief of Naval Staff of the Indian Navy was the guest yesterday. So there is no better platform than Colombo conducting its own security awareness programs, conferences, and creating a platform for all these partners coming in together on one unified, I would say, a set here based out in Colombo. So initiatives such as these and the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium is again one of the, I would say, a framework which is used as a platform for all navies to potentially come together and exchange experiences, exchange their knowledge, their training components. So such platforms, and in future, if those platforms are also be done in the context of, let's say, in the tri-services component of the Army and the Air Force, those components will bring in better synergy not only among the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and the Coast Guard per se, but also among other littoral states and regional powers. So those platforms are very potential to do it.
You carry out a lot of research on radicalization, extremism, and the impact of this. I think it's very important to talk about our region, where you're from, where I'm from. But in Sri Lanka, according to your research, what risks do we have?
In terms of Sri Lanka, the purview of extremism is something that academics in Europe and academics all over have been studying it very aggressively. Easter bombings wasn't just, I would say, a reflection of what is coming up next. And the idea is there shouldn't be anything coming up next. So it's very important that domestic security initiatives are being tightened. There is intelligence exchange programs that are being conducted. Law enforcement training needs to be better. So there is a whole lot of sets that need to be undertaken in a uniform or an umbrella capacity that provides a holistic approach to the, I would say, sharp the edge of the Sri Lankan sword. So yes, extremism is something we as scholars have been very, I would say, watchful of. And what happened from 2014 till today, the exposure of the tech-savvy Sri Lankans, there are a lot of content that comes in, including Wahhabi content, Salafi content, with radical elements coming in, propagating and doing various kinds of propaganda, justifying their cause. That is something that needs to be dealt very, very carefully. And let me be the first. I'm probably not the first, but let me reiterate to tell you that that extremism is something that can't be removed, or I would say de-radicalized immediately, but it's a long sustained process. But the thing is, one should always be careful enough not to go too far, but also not to be too slow. So the whole prognosis lies up to the Sri Lankan administration as to how they aim to perceive, because it's not a very, I would say, small decision, but it is potentially a decision that the administration, every administration, nonetheless, because we are here, we're talking about Colombo, if would have been anywhere else, we would have talked about it. All member states have a responsibility to look at it very carefully. And if you compare as to any other state who have done it significantly very well, there is no one who has attained or achieved it to a level where there is 100% or even a 50%. There is no margin to achieve how much de-radicalization one can successfully conduct in a state or even in a province. But the important thing is starting it.
You mentioned the Easter attacks of 2019. Sri Lanka woke up to a threat of extremism at that time. But what risks, are there any perceived risks in the academic world on Sri Lanka?
There are extremism per se, as I said, is one of the challenges that has been resonated in the academic world. The influence of small elements such as illegal smuggling, racketeering, human trafficking, migrant smuggling. These are some of the, I would say, challenges within the umbrella of a broader security threats that Colombo or Sri Lanka as a island nation faces. But as I said, I attended the Gold Dialogue, and I'm very pleased to see that the Navy and the Coast Guard are doing pretty much robust initiatives by sharing information. There's an intelligence exchange program happening. So those are existing ones. But yes, there is law enforcement strengthening is absolutely necessary, because on boots on the ground, it essentially the first responder is the law enforcement in different provinces, in different federal level. So that is something that the government needs to think about.
You mentioned it has to be dealt with. So when we say deal with it, is it through law? Apart from the strengthening of law enforcement operations and the online space, what do we do about that?
In terms of law is, I would say, from the prosecution element. Law defines severity, but when it comes to, I would say, eliminating the whole element of individuals who have the knack to do it, then that calls for robust intelligence service. And with robust intelligence service also means a time-effective, real-time centric law enforcement response, which also means a premeditated response towards threats that could have happened in the near future. Now, as an academic, it is very easy for me to say those words, but when we see it on the ground, the reality is totally different. So strengthening the arm of law enforcement, like for example the Special Task Force or the armed response units of the Sri Lankan police, the investigative capacity of the Sri Lankan police, those are just words but I'm sure they are more strengthened. But there is something where Sri Lankan administration I think needs to a bit of a focus on in terms of law enforcement, training of apparatus, different trainings with different, I would say, entities and regional powers, also fills the knowledge gap of what one entity or one state or one country might not have been taking care of. So in terms of digital space, it is easy for me to comment upon that, but the Sri Lankan administration needs to take a bit more, I would say, seriously on the content, because there's a wide Sri Lankan population that travel to the Middle East as migrants, as workers, as technicians. They're a highly intellectual community that travels all the way across the world from Sri Lanka. So their exposure might not be always taken in a positive sense. So monitoring digital space is something by bringing either a digital law which kind of prohibits the I would say access of what one has to see in terms of terror groups of watchful eyes on terror propaganda, that again boils down to intelligence services being strengthened.
We saw that after the Easter attacks, Sri Lanka was shocked that those who were involved had been given good education, had access to far more than what the average population would have. So revisiting where these extremist ideologies take root or play a role in radicalizing youth, women, children, how they're so effective. What can we learn from you, from your research?
And as per my research, I've had the opportunity to interact with multiple law enforcement institutions throughout my career, but there is no one-stop solution. If that is what you're asking me, there's no one-stop solution, because every law enforcement institution or intelligence service has their own unique experiences. When you talk about Easter attacks, and when you look at the education of the individuals who conducted it, terror element or ideology-based terror incidents does not essentially reflect in somebody's appearance. So a terrorist doesn't have a big eyes, big nose, and big ears. So they are normal individuals, regular members of the community, but their access, their experience, their past experiences, all of this have potentially changed, altered their circumstances, their behavioral patterns into a new personality, maybe a hatred towards the system, inability to achieve a particular objective, unsuccessful in their lifestyle, to geopolitical events that have been impacted across the Middle East, which we have talked about exhaustively. Those events have exhaustive implications on one mindset. Can you imagine let's say a 20-year-old or an 18-year-old, 16-year-old college student spends 24 hours on Instagram scrolling the Israeli bombings of cities, the areas in Gaza. Now, if you look at those content for 24 hours, a lot of behavioral symptoms is going to change. Sort of personal experiences, his or her inability to achieve success in life will combine together, and a hatred towards the system will eventually propagate. Now, that is something that is beyond the scope of any conventional law enforcement institutions, no matter how best it is. So the idea revolves around developing school education programs, because that is where the children are most vulnerable when they're looking at access to online content. And that is where, if it's been regulated in a way that puts them in a right path, that gives them the idea of how to do it right.
I'm told we don't have much time, so let's quickly talk about India. I think most of our countries look to India for support in crisis. At the same time, for India to be the big power it is when considering smaller nations as Sri Lanka and the rest of the world to support, to integrate, and to stand as a stronger bloc, not against, but amid the rest of the world. What role does India have? Is India conscious, do you think, of its role as a bigger country in our region?
I think India is the most conscious, if I say it. Now, it might sound a bit funny because of where I come from, but it's not entirely in the context of my nationality, but it is absolutely, if you look at the New Delhi's programs in terms of bringing in not only Global South together, but in the region of BIMSTEC, in the areas of Indian Ocean Alliance. And if you look at from a regional or a broader perspective, you can have Quad as an example. So I think New Delhi is a very responsible actor. And you have seen it, Sri Lanka has experienced it during the time of when New Delhi has always been the forefront of providing naval aid ships and frequent port docks and exercises to the Sri Lankan Navy. And the visit of the Chief of Naval Staff yesterday is also one of the pillars of strength that New Delhi is open and New Delhi is willing to help any regional or even to the countries far and wide who open the doors for more broader cooperation, not only in Global South, but as in the Asia Pacific or in the world per se.
Well, that's all the time we have here at Hyde Park. Thank you very much, Anant, for your time and for sharing your expertise and your perspectives.
Thank you so much for having me.
We were in conversation with Anant Mishra, Curie Research Fellow of the International Centre for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales, joining us here at Hyde Park to talk about South Asia, the Middle East and the growth or escalation of incidences in the Middle East, the potential for radicalization and extremism, what options the rest of the world has. We'll be back next week with yet another discussion here at Hyde Park. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Good night.